As many of you might be aware, the main reason for my break back in the spring was due to my father being rushed to hospital with cancer. Whilst the doctors have performed their own miracles and he's back home now with my mother, mentioning this to people on the forums has prompted many to put the blame on God for giving him his cancer in the first place. This, in my opinion, is the classic blame game, where they put every negative thing on God. This is nothing unusual. Even the things that humans do without divine encouragement or intervention. However, this question of why bad things happen to good people is one that is worthwhile addressing. Many people might think it's completely ridiculous, but it is worthwhile doing so. Firstly, to see if it's true, and second, to see if there is a reason for it. So I invite you to join me on this examination of this contentious question that puts the omnibenevolent God under the spotlight. Before we start looking at the history and theology of it, I'm going to clearly state that I am rejecting any notion of determinism. If humans are the product of the electrical signals and influence of others, it renders all things equal in terms of morality, meaning there's no such thing as good or bad, right or wrong, a good person or an evil one. They are the same and render any discussion of morality merely a product of us, and removes God having anything to say from the table. If you don't want to believe in free will, that is your choice, but the moral ground relies on the potential to do differently. If you can't do anything different, then the moral argument doesn't really come in. With that out of the way, let's see if God is the bastard people claim he is. Interestingly enough, it's harder to find examples of bad things happening to good people than I expected. I would have expected there to be tons of examples of good, loving people suddenly falling on hard times or getting shafted by life or the state. However, the histories seem to have little in examples of this. This makes me think it's either personal testimony, which would be a fine thing to push at the atheists, or they are all small events that don't get publicised on the web because they're just not clickbait worthy. Most of the articles that on people suffering are about those that came through it and rose to greatness. People like Gandhi, Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, Genghis Khan, and Adolf Hitler. Really? I think you can sort of see my problem here. Even biblical articles focusing on the suffering of Job, Paul, and David mostly focus on pushing the push through and reach for God, which entirely goes in the wrong direction. Not that good things can only come to bad people or something like that, or that bad things happen to good people. But despite they have to push through and reach for greatness. Does this mean that it isn't true, and the examples of bad things happening to good people are merely flukes that can't be explained, given in personal testimony? I did some digging into historical people who did great things that were considered controversial, and landed on Martin Luther King Jr., who was assassinated after making his I Have a Dream speech, which pushed for equality of the African American people. I was going to dismiss this, but again, getting assassinated is a form of evil for doing deeds, evil or otherwise. That led me to Abraham Lincoln, who made the Emancipation Proclamation, and then John F. Kennedy, who was a storming success in his presidency, according to many polls. Same goes for many great martyrs like Jeanne d'Arc, George W. Lee, Athanas Dorcas, Bhagrat Singh, and Maximilian Kolbe, all killed because they were doing good deeds. If we're looking into Christian law, we find the apostles such as Paul, Peter, Luke, and Thomas, all tortured and killed for spreading their faith by peaceful means. Add that to the later saints like Stephen, Valentine, and Lawrence, and you see the spreading of the gospel wasn't a safe task, as Jesus warned in Matthew chapter 10. But to truly push test this hypothesis, we should ideally find if the opposite is true. Do good things happen to bad people? This wasn't so hard to find, since Reddit has been happily asking this question and named around 40 people who committed heinous crimes and got away with it scot-free. People such as Jimmy Savile, Mao Zedong, Mother Teresa, and Joseph Goebbels, whose names are still enshrined in the alternative narrative they wove over their evil deeds. Many will also point out that US presidents like Reagan, Jackson, and quite possibly Trump as well, who is still rather getting away with things. I'm not going to hide the fact that a good number of the people mentioned here were openly part of the Christian church, because this is not something to defend the church, but merely examining the hypothesis which I've mentioned, which includes these people in its scope. Some may also point out that people in the Bible, like Herod, Jacob, Abraham, David, and Judas Iscariot, never got punished for their crimes. It seems that the divine isn't on the side of the good, and the devil reigns on earth. Or God simply doesn't care. So now we have to start asking ourselves, if God does care, why is all this the case? Why do good people suffer and die whilst the cruel people get away with doing whatever they want to whomever they want? This is very much linked to a video that I'll be doing soon, currently in the writing, which references the richest people in the world and how they have so much money, but they don't choose to use it to benefit others, only themselves. That is the thing. People such as Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, Zuckerberg, and many others, they are all wealthy people. They could pay the required amount to stop world hunger twice over with just their income tax alone, and yet they don't. They hoard their wealth to do anything in their power to build it up and avoid losing it. Elon Musk, you could say, is a bit controversial in that because he technically isn't wealthy, but he has a lot of wealth stored up in stocks. He is not paid an income, so he avoids any tax. Instead, he simply borrows money and can put all of his expenses, all of his collateral, all the loan payments onto his shares in Tesla and other such companies, to the point where there was a big debate about whether he could or even should use his shares in Tesla as collateral for a loan, particularly when he bought out Twitter. He doesn't pay tax on them, and yet he still uses them to buy a loan. I'm not alone in disliking billionaires, by the way. This isn't just a Christian thing. Famous atheist Forrest Valkai of the ACA calls them the most dangerous minority in the world. We disagree on many things, but this isn't one of them. The term to describe this behaviour is selfishness, and this we can apply to all of those that never faced punishment during their lives. Jimmy Savile took what he wanted from anyone he wanted, often those weaker than himself, and no one ever spoke out against him. He was loved until after he passed away, and then finally someone came forwards. He was powerful and no one to talk out against him. Mother Teresa never questioned her belief that pain brought someone closer to God while she lived in luxury. So many royal families and high politicians use their positions of power and influence to make their lives much easier. A classic example is Donald Trump. He passed laws to prevent him from facing prosecution for his actions, despite being convicted of over 30 felonies throughout his career and presidencies, both of them. The simple fact is, the richest men can end world hunger. But as far as I'm concerned, because they don't, this proves my point. But how does this relate to those who suffer despite their good deeds? What's the justification for it? The simple answer I'm going to go for is turning to an example of my church patron, St. Francis of Assisi. I grew up at St. Francis of Assisi Church. Unlike many of the Catholic saints, he died of natural causes rather than execution, so he wasn't quite a martyr. Instead, he denied himself many things. He was a humble person, giving his cloak to someone who needed it and living in poverty despite being venerated above many nobles of the time. The story I'm particularly thinking of is the stigmata, the wounds of Christ which he received during a vision on Mount Eleverna. It's unclear if the wounds hurt, since few examples have been canonised, but since Francis took care to hide them, I can assume he did. This shows selflessness that I think can be recognised in the majority of martyrs across history, not just the Christian ones. Maximilian Kolbe was executed in Auschwitz in the stead of another prisoner. Jeanne d'Arc died to liberate her people from the English oppression, and Bhagwan Singh did the same for his people in India. They chose to suffer and die to protect their people from the things they were suffering. I would never ever tell anyone to be a martyr, but I can't deny that it's a true sign of love. No wonder many patriots say the old line, dulce decorum est pro patria more. It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country. To bring it home once more via St. Francis, I wonder if during his vision he saw Jesus on the cross and asked him to take on the suffering of Jesus. Asked for him to take on the suffering. To spare him the pain of crucifixion. A famously torturous way to die. When we think back on those who suffer despite their good deeds, I wonder if we're looking at it the wrong way. To use my father as an example, he worked as a policeman for 30 years, was a chorister since boyhood, and was a dedicated father and partner in many ways. Yes, me and my brothers gave him stress, and his receding hairline stands as testament to that. But he would always allow us to come home because of his love for us. He refused to be a burden, only going to the doctor when absolutely necessary, and clearly being sorry for putting them to any stress on his part. That could be very much part of his upbringing, very much a family trait, could very much be just he was a product of his generation and didn't want to be a bother to anyone. He had to be self-sufficient. But you can't deny that was the one thing that meant he couldn't go to get help. The main reason I had to stop my videos during his hospital stay was because I was taking over all of the jobs he did around the house. That being the laundry, the dog walking, the cleaning, the washing up, helping my mum with cooking, and making sure she was getting to her activities, all of which was exacerbated by her progressing Alzheimer's. He never wanted this to fall on us, or to make himself a burden. And that means he neglected himself. And he wasn't diagnosed until he was unable to help himself and got rushed to hospital. He suffered so we wouldn't have to. I'm sure if people look back at their own examples of this, they would find similar situations where those who did the most for their people put themselves in the line of fire to protect the ones they love. I've always said altruism isn't a survival trait. And this is evidence of this. The only reason it gets passed on is by learning rather than by genetics. Further proving, in my opinion, that determinism is not a thing. It has to be, since this has to be learned, otherwise we wouldn't be all selfish people. Selfishness is more viable as a survival trait, as we see, because they can walk all over people. But this is where God steps in. Jesus died on the cross for us, so we can recognize God's love for us. And as we recognize that, we recognize the burden, gave him our sins, and are able to live a new life. Giving himself to us, suffering for us, in the most horrendous execution method in history, so we can see his love. I've always said the way to show Christ in us is to be like him. Not by performing miracles, not by preaching, not by getting nailed to a tree. That was just high school for me. But by talking and taking the suffering of the world onto us, so that no one else has to. In short, bad things happen to good people because they don't want them to happen to others. All I can hope is that I carry this into fatherhood so that my own child can live a life free from suffering, but was also showing compassion for those around them. If you know someone who is like this, who is practically setting themselves on fire to warm those they love, show them how much you appreciate them. And make sure they get some time to go look after themselves too. A saying in Britain is, you can't pour tea from an empty pot. So go fill up your pot. I don't want what happened to my dad to be the same reason you lose someone in your life. There's that, lovely. Thank you. Stay humble, stay safe, and God be with you, my friends.